A third type of graph that we can be asked to make from the information from our frequency distribution table is something called an ogive, O-G-I-V-E. And an ogive, we are going to look at plotting dots again, but for the plotting of the dots, we want to go upper class boundary, comma, cumulative frequency, so that we can see how the data values accumulated over those spans. So what we need to do to get started to make an ogive is to actually get another column within our frequency distribution table, which is the cumulative frequency. And you can kind of think of the cumulative frequency as just a running total of the frequencies that you've had through the classes. So my cumulative frequency for my first class, I have a frequency of 7. But then by the time I include my first class frequency as well as my second class frequency, my cumulative frequency would be 7 plus 3 or 10. Then by the time I include those data values plus the data values I got in the third class, I'll have a running total of 12. Again, 12 plus the 5 we get in our fourth class will give us a cumulative frequency of 17. And then 17 plus 1 gives me a cumulative frequency of 18. And your final value in your cumulative frequency of all your classes should match up to the number of data values you had in the original data set. Now with an ogive, the data points that we plot are the upper class boundary comma, the cumulative frequency. So on our vertical axis, we're going to write cumulative frequency. Just to make sure we remember that. And along our markings on the horizontal axis, I don't want to mark the midpoints this time for an ogive. I want to mark the class boundaries. So my very first class lower boundary is 14.5, and I need to make my mark to show there's an adjustment of the scaling. And then its upper class boundary is 21.5, which is where the next one starts, so I don't need to write that number again. But then its upper class boundary is 28.5, and then 35.5, and then 42.5, and our last class's upper class boundary is 49.5. Now we're going to graph upper class boundary, comma, cumulative frequency for each of these classes. So for my first class, my upper class boundary is 21.5, and my cumulative frequency is 7. So I will draw a dot here. For the second class, the upper class boundary is the 28.5, and the cumulative frequency is 10. So I'll draw a dot here. Then we have a third class's upper class boundary is 35.5, and a cumulative frequency of 12. For the fourth class, our upper class boundary is 42.5, and a cumulative frequency of 17. So this was 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. And then for our last class, the upper class boundary was 49.5, and a cumulative frequency of 18. Now, we do still want to connect these dots with the line segments, so we will go ahead and connect them with the line segments. Now, the difference of the finishing part of an ogive is you do come from the horizontal axis and the lower class boundary of the very first class up to the first dot, but you don't come back down off of the last dot. With an ogive, you finish it off just by showing the growth there. So these are kind of nice ways of actually visually seeing something later on that is an idea of percentiles in order to get the values. Now let's go ahead and make sure that we mark our scaling along the vertical axis. And that finishes out the work of the ogive.